To have two of our amazing alumni joining us this evening for conversation, and we're glad that you were all able to make it given this busy time of year. As many of you know, we've been very busy at Presidio, not just finishing our semester, but actually we have just recently announced a merger with the University of Redlands. If you're an alum, we will be having an information topic on this on January 12th, so please stay tuned for an email invitation to that. And so that we can get right on to our topic of the evening, I want to introduce Dr. Victoria Wu. She is a serial entrepreneur with 30 years of experience in startups, international management, and academia. She's the director of the San Francisco Hub for Business at INSEAD. She teaches entrepreneurship at Stanford and at Presidio. She also founded 5 startups. She co-designed executive programs at INSEAD and Harvard. And she's also the creator of the podcast course, Everyone is an Entrepreneur, which is available on the Himalaya podcast platform. So obviously she's been doing a lot. She's also an artist. I will add that. I've seen her studio. So Vic is going to introduce our guest panelists and ask questions, and then there'll be time at the end for all of you to ask questions as well. So I'm going to just turn it over to Vic.
Thanks, Maggie. Happy to be here to help out. A couple of things. I'm pleased to introduce our panelists. First of all, we've got Peter Glenn and Scott Oltmann. Say hello. For housekeeping comments, you can submit your questions throughout the webinar using the question function at the bottom of your Zoom window. And if you can also upvote these questions that are being submitted, but I'll kick it off with a set of questions, obviously, and we'll answer the audience questions at the end of the panel. So maybe we'll start with Scott. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, on your experience as an alum and at Rivian?
Yeah, Scott Oltmann, C25. I feel like I haven't said that since grad school. Went to Presidio 2016 to 2018 after spending about 8 years abroad, living in Europe and South America and Southeast Asia. I got into the electric vehicle industry actually through the alumni network. I knew very little about charging and almost nothing about real estate, which is kind of the intersection of EV charging. But fortunately, elements of my background happened to be of value to the company that I was applying to, which was Volta Charging. Also, the MBA of Presidio certainly helped. I would say, I was really interested in Volta because of their efforts to democratize access to charging through a really unique business model where they would install chargers with large advertising screens at popular retail locations. And the advertising would make it free for the landowners, free for the tenants, as well as free for the end user. And I'd say probably perhaps what was equally unique was their focus to build charging infrastructure at places where drivers were already going. So like grocery stores, shopping malls, movies, concerts, hospitals, and so on. My role there was focused on site acquisition. So in other words, I was finding ideal locations to install their chargers and build out their charging network. But charging is certainly a multi-sector, multi-industry initiative. And I felt it was important to get experience working at an OEM like Rivian in a role that focused more in the public sector and with utilities. So I jumped over the Rivian, where I've been helping lead their Waypoints team on the public sector and utility side as their senior partnership development manager. And currently I'm in charge of the US market. So I work with state agencies, municipalities, counties, towns, transit authorities, and all different utilities.
Awesome. Peter, do you want to tell us a little bit about your background and your company that you founded?
Sure. Yeah, so Peter Glenn, C11. I graduated in 2011. Most of my background in EVs is largely self-taught through co-founding my startup EV Life. I think I got into EVs also through clean energy. And so, I didn't necessarily work for any electric vehicle companies, but I've worked at, larger tech companies and led marketing biz dev at Glassdoor, Singularity University. And most notably, this is the second clean energy startup that I've worked at that has become a bit of a fintech. And so my first startup out of Presidio back in 2011, I was extremely fortunate right after graduation. A role opened up through some friends that I met through Net Impact, Presidio's Net Impact community. And I connected with the startup Phoenix International, venture-backed startup that was developing off-grid energy solutions for the billion plus people that live off the electric grid, largely in Africa, Southeast Asia. And Phoenix was really focused. They developed this incredible off-grid battery and lighting system, and it could power any home off-grid, but sales were a bit slow. And we actually pioneered one of the first micro solar leases in Africa using mobile money to pay 30 cents per day lease to own. And we just saw like sales skyrocket when we drove the daily price of electricity, solar electricity on a lease down below what people were paying for fossil fuel, for kerosene lighting and phone charging at different kiosks. And I bring that up because we scaled to 3 million users off of that business model and that fintech platform. And then we're acquired by NG, and now they're scaling, across Africa. I bring that up a lot in the context of electric vehicles because that's very much what we're trying to do at EV Life. My startup EV Life, I'm a co-founder. I started the company back in 2019. And the problem we've been working on solving for the past 3+ years is addressing the green premium for electric vehicles. So as many of you know, if you've gone EV shopping, you can look at a gas car and an electric car and see a car that's largely the same shape and size, but about $10,000 more. Fortunately, in states like California, you can add $2,000 to $4,000 in a state rebate onto a $7,500 federal tax credit, and you get $10,000 plus to bridge that gap. It takes 6 to 18 months to get those rebates and tax credits back. And so what we're doing is using our fintech platform to qualify customers for their uniquely qualified tax credits and rebates, letting them use it like a down payment and lowering their monthly payments by $200 a month and giving them 18 months and tools to help file all those tax credits and rebates just to make it easier. So we like to say that we're making financing EV cheaper than a gas car today. We don't have to wait for price parity to come many years from now. We can actually just do it today. So that's really our focus. Yeah.
Great. I mean, I see some parallel in your first startup in terms of using price as a part of your strategy and your innovation value to customers. That's very cool. Okay, so the first question is that the U.S. has passed recently that there are EV tax credits and charger installations, and states like California and New York have passed bans on new gas cars or ICE cars sold by 2035. What impact would the federal and state policies have on driving EV adoption, including the pros and cons, if you can discuss? Peter, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So I think at a state level, it's really exciting to see California as well as New York, and I think soon Massachusetts and Washington State plan to take the lead in terms of banning the sale of new gas cars. I think that's a great signal to consumers that it's time to start thinking seriously about EVs. And we've seen those shifts in the mindset of the thousands of users that come to our website every month. There was a huge spike when California banned gas cars. And all of a sudden people were like, hey, what's my gas car going to be worth if I'm trying to resell it in California, 10 years from now, right? And so it's changed the mindsets. I think it's also going to keep funding in place in those states especially for low to middle income customers to be able to get involved, have those $2,000 to $4,000 to $5,000 state rebates is really important. And then also particularly money for charging, particularly in areas where apartment dwellers and condo owners have a harder time installing charging. I think the billions of dollars that the California Energy Commission that authorized in NYSERDA in New York and other entities, their funding is really key. I think from EV Life's perspective, we follow even more closely the national level, what's happening with the Inflation Reduction Act. They've uncapped the $7,500 federal tax credit through 2032, huge market signal to the automakers, to consumers. Time is now, let's get to it in terms of putting the tax credit in place. And then new EV tax credits will be available January 1, also through 2032, up to $4,000 for electric vehicles reselling under $25,000. There are a ton of asterisks there, and you should totally use a site like EV Life to help understand what you actually qualify for today versus January 1. We can help you with that, but at a macro level, the trends are incredible in terms of helping accelerate EV adoption and drive affordability. And then the Infrastructure Act, Scott could probably speak more to, but billions of dollars poured into all 50 states to have EV charging plans, especially public EV charging, is really critical. So I'll flip it over to Scott to see what he has to say about the charging side.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you covered quite a lot there, so I'll try to add some additional context here. But I will say that, while the availability of new EV models and innovation in industry has been one of the primary driving factors in the speed up of transportation electrification, so have policies like the ones that were mentioned that the federal government and states have passed to incentivize consumers to go electric. And some of those are the Zero Emission Vehicles Regulation, the Advanced Clean Trucks Act, and then Act 2. LCFS credits, that's another, the low carbon fuel standard, that's another driving factor as well. I would say that continuing to pass these policies and funding programs reduces the cost of EV ownership, expands access to EV charging, encourages companies to onshore their manufacturing, invest in research and development to continue innovation in an industry that is rapidly growing. And all of this, speed up the adoption of electric vehicles and ultimately the decarbonization of our transportation system. Now, to what Peter was saying about the IIJA, the infrastructure that's coming out of there, I think is really key in helping this transition. We have oh, I'm so sorry, I got a little sidetracked. I see Maggie's photo and I thought that she was stalled. It's just her photo. So I was like, she's staring very intently. Anyway, I digress. The IIJ, out of that comes the NEVI, which is about $5 billion that's being put towards building out DC fast charging along corridors across the US. I think the key thing in there for me and in the work that we're doing on our team is that a large percentage of that has to be allocated to disadvantaged communities or low-income communities to help build out that infrastructure. In addition to the NEVI funding, there's also the discretionary grants program, which I think a lot of people kind of overlook. And within the discretionary grants program, there's two buckets. There's the corridor charging, which is going to be more support for fast charging. And then the one that I'm really excited about is community charging. Guidance hasn't come out in that yet. It should come out probably in January, but that's likely going to be primarily focused on underserved communities and in rural areas, the areas where I think there's a really large opportunity for adoption of electric vehicles, but just isn't quite there yet because there's no charging infrastructure or limited charging infrastructure that's available. One thing that I would say about like in the question you mentioned the sort of the sunsetting of ICE vehicles in 2035 in California. This may not be a popular opinion, but in California specifically, I'm not sure how much sunsetting the sale of ICE vehicles will have. I think it's a positive step in the right direction. But the reason why I say that is California is already far ahead. I think it's about 1 in 5 cars sold in California have a plug. So banning ICE vehicles in 12 years may not have a huge impact on something that's kind of already happening. Where I do see the significance in something like this is here in California is how policies and initiatives in California help get other states to follow. So you typically will see a lot of progressive environmental policies and initiatives that start in California and sort of make their way across the country. And we're seeing this not just on the state level, but also on the local level. So I think it's Santa Fe, New Mexico isn't banning the sale of ICE vehicles, but by I think 2025, they plan to have a minimum of 7% of their vehicle sales be clean vehicles. So those things are happening at a local level that I think will also have a positive impact on adoption.
Cool. We've gone through kind of the economics of owning a vehicle all the way to policy pushing towards it and infrastructure for us to actually influence behavior. And we also went over equitability of it. So what are the most important trends and changes in the EV charging market? And how do you see EV charging technology advancing? Maybe Scott, we start with you.
Yeah. I want to be respectful of time, but I think I want one thing that just kind of came to mind about with the last question, and I think perhaps worth noting is the challenge in electrification of transportation that utilities are and will have with this transition. In California, while overall the grid can likely handle the total volume to produce the amount of energy needed by 2035, the challenge, I think, will be, and this is in some recent reports, I think from PG&E, will be shifting usage and production to match each other by hour of day and by season. And I think that the PG&E report also said that it will require billions of dollars of transmission upgrades in the last mile transition of electricity. So we talk about the pros a lot in these policies and the transportation electrification, but it's important to recognize some of the challenges that also poses with this transition. I see Peter nodding his head. I don't know if you want to jump in before I hop to the next question.
Oh, I'm just really excited about this kind of a future topic with vehicle to grid. A lot of early data is out on the California heat wave this summer, and there were a lot of fears of the power grid cutting out, and a lot of backup batteries in particular were used in homes, Tesla Powerwalls, etc. And conservation as well. People getting emergency text and using apps like Connect to reduce their energy consumption, virtual power plants type apps. But I think as we were able to connect our vehicles to the grid as well, there could be also more flexibility in terms of dealing with demand response in the grid. If we think about grid 1.0, there's a lot of folks that are retiring now that think that this is impossible to get all these vehicles on the grid. But if you think about grid 2.0, machine learning, artificial intelligence, all this interactive exchange that can happen in terms of energy between the batteries in our home, the batteries in our cars, and the grid, solar, all sorts of different sources of energy being more fluid. I think there's huge opportunities there as well. And I think California, the CEC did a study that I think the net benefit of vehicle to grid would be $5 billion a year to the electric grid and to ratepayers, just by having stored energy in the vehicles that California anticipates having over the next 5 to 10 years. Just in terms of reduced capacity that would be needed from a generation perspective at peak times. So just some thoughts there on vehicle to grid and demand response.
Yeah,
Thanks, Peter.
Totally. Exciting times. So, we're really talking about mobility and transportation. The focus is on EVs, but I think it's an exciting time for all of the trends that's happening.
Yeah.
So,
So
Scott, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. So just to answer the last question that you just had, historically, there have been a handful of charging companies placing charging in places with the highest utilization, often tied to EV ownership numbers. There also haven't been historically federal standards these companies had to abide by. And this was what was needed, the first 10 years of charging installation to meet the current need. And regulators were still assessing what the right standards were to impose. This also created huge gaps in charging infrastructure, especially in rural communities, and created kind of an inconsistent and often unreliable network. But with new market entrants, charging incentives, federal standards, spurred on by things like we've been talking about, like NEVI, I think we're going to see charging being ubiquitous despite geography, a reliable charging experience, and hopefully a competitive market for vendors that encourage innovation on the project. And some of probably the three trends that there's a lot of different trends that are happening, and Peter's mentioned a few of them that are really exciting, really innovative stuff with AI. I'd say probably the three trends that stick out to me. One is probably one of the most important trends in the charging market is standardization of plugs. So the plug is the nozzle that plugs into the vehicle. And again, I'm speaking specifically for EV charging. Not long ago, open network DC charging, so fast charging, had two different plugs, CHAdeMO and CCS. And in the last year or so, there's been a shift to just one plug. And so standardizing plugs gives drivers access to more chargers, and increasing access to charging infrastructure is a major component to driving adoption of EVs. And then in that same vein, there are still a handful of car companies that have proprietary charging. In other words, chargers only accessible to their customers. And I think the most notable example is Tesla. Now, while I give a lot of kudos, obviously, to Tesla, because I think that while the exclusive access to a charging network has done a lot to increase sales and get more EVs on the road, I think these companies are starting to recognize the importance, not just for the industry, but also as a business decision to open up their networks. So sort of, universalizing access to charging networks. The second trend that I see that I think is important is around energy management. Already we're seeing that more and more of purchasing decisions are based on the capability to handle energy because it brings direct benefits in the form of saving costs. For example, grid connection and installation costs. And I think Peter could probably speak more to that. And then I'd say the third trend that I'm seeing that I'm excited about is streamlining the permitting process. This isn't necessarily directly tied to any sort of technology, but from a policy perspective, there are a few nonprofits. I think Spur is one of them in the Bay Area, working on this issue. I think it's, again, Spur, don't quote me on that. Unfortunately, this is recorded, so I am being kind of quoted on this. They did the same thing in solar and now are working across private and public sectors to develop a similar initiative. This is still probably a couple of years out, but this is important because permitting can often be a long, arduous process. So creating standardization around this for EV charging is exciting. But I would probably end my rant in saying ultimately, any technology or policy that increases access to charging and improves the charging experience, such as like uptime and reliability, quicker charging sessions, convenient locations, is going to have a significant impact on adoption.
Well, on that note, I think it is a nice segue to our next question is, how can we make access to electric cars and EV charging stations equitable to all socioeconomic classes? And we just talked about, standardization, different nonprofits pushing for it. What are you seeing out there?
I'll speak to the EV charging side, and then Peter, you can hop over the electric vehicle side. Again, a lot of things I've said, past, total cost of ownership bills, fund programs that offset the cost of installing chargers in communities that have been historically overlooked, provide technical support to these communities, streamline communication around vehicle incentives, make it easier for customers to access those incentives, et cetera. There's really no way to, except for probably EV Life, to make a $65,000 car affordable, which is, I believe, and Peter, correct me if I'm wrong, which is the average cost of a new EV. And when you have demand this much higher than supply, low income folks probably won't be able to get access to those vehicles. So prices have to come down.
Yeah. Peter?
Just building on Scott's thought, I think that because there's so many high-end luxury EVs, that average gets a little bit skewed. I think the average price of an EV, like on our loan wait list right now, is probably around closer to $40,000, because it skews like starting at the Nissan Leafs, which is typically the lowest, like starting, high 20s, low 30s, up to, the Mustang Mach-E's from Ford, the Ioniq 5s from Honda, those vehicles are all coming in the low 40s. And so I think we need to see an increase in electric vehicles that come in, in the 30s and 40s to start, and then work our way down. Look, I mean, states like California and New York that have made these pledges to go zero emission and ban gas cars are the ones that for the past decade or more have been investing the most in particularly equitable incentives, both on the charging side, the public charging side, investing in public charging networks, and then also special lower income kind of bonuses for rebates in the state. For example, state of California, if you're income qualified, which for a family of 4 or 5 could be making $150,000 a year to income qualify. That's kind of below the poverty line a bit. Could qualify for up to $4,500 in rebates instead of $2,000 in rebates, which is the standard offer. So those things are all great. I'm going to be a little counterintuitive here and say that I think the biggest thing that we need to ensure access to electric vehicles is equitable is for more people who can afford to go electric to do so now. Because accelerating the adoption of EVs is going to send a clearer than ever market signal to automakers that they need to make these more affordable vehicles, and they can also achieve economies of scale and drive down the overall price of vehicles. I think those things are really key. And we also think that the type of incentive-based financing that EV Life offers to effectively use financing to make qualified incentives available point of sale instead of waiting 6 to 18 months is also key for driving down the costs. So there are different ways to drive down the monthly payments for EVs that go beyond waiting for price parity to come on a hardware basis from an automaker. So all of the above, but I think again, like the emphasis should really be on those who can't afford to go electric, really getting them to go electric today to drive down the costs as we get economies of scale. It's hard to get perspective. Like to Scott's point, California, 18% of the state is now electric. That's still a small number, but looking nationally, it's more like 5 to 7% of new cars sold are electric vehicles. But in terms of total vehicles on the road in the US, less than 1% of them have an electric plug. And so we're still very early days. I mean, if we're talking about, sometimes it is challenging to have conversations with folks in different state agencies because they're thinking about bringing new electric vehicles to literally the lowest income customer. And that's a challenge too. That's somewhat unrealistic. Like, I think we need to focus on leveraging the middle class's buying power to drive down the overall price. So I would put a lot of emphasis there. And that's where we spend a lot of our time too.
Yeah.
And Peter, I'm curious, what is there a car company or model that's either out yet or coming to the US that you think is interesting or innovative that could be like in the more $30,000 range? Like where are you seeing that?
Yeah, I want to say, oh man, is it the Malibu EV that's coming out? I think GM is probably making the strongest play of all the major automakers in the US to really win on price. I mean, the Bolt is obviously an incredible, and the Bolt EV they're obviously like very low cost electric vehicles with a very high range. I think that's a really strong play for GM. I'd be really curious to see how it plays out. But even seeing the Ford F-150 Lightning start at around $40,000, that's a very attractive price for that truck, especially when you factor in the total cost of ownership of the gas version versus the electric version.
Right.
I mean, you're talking about a fifth of the operating costs when you consider the fuel. So, there's huge opportunities out there. I think GM is probably making the biggest play on the affordability side, but most of their vehicles aren't coming out until next year. And so it's hard to say how the market's going to receive those vehicles, but I'm glad to see them leading on affordability.
Yeah, there's one company that I've been following more recently, NIO, and I don't know if you have more information on that, Peter, but they're reducing the cost of the electric vehicle because you're not purchasing the battery with the vehicle. And so it reduces it by whatever the cost of the battery typically is, around $10,000, $11,000. And so they're projecting price points of that lower $30,000 range. They're not in the US yet, but I think that they could be a potential strong player to help the market move forward.
I'm not familiar with NIO, but where is it coming from?
They're coming from China. They're probably most known for their battery swapping technology for vehicles, and that's a whole nother topic.
That's a whole another topic, but I think the idea that Peter put forth, which is mass adoption, which will make it the economies of scale of actually producing them, and not only in progressive states such as California that we all live in and love, but really across the nation is really important. So my next question is, what is the biggest single thing that an individual can do to drive the electrification of transportation? I mean, not just EV, but mobility, period.
Peter, you kind of already answered this, but so I'll let you I'll let you take this one.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think that I'm often asked for a single answer. I'm going to say that I recommend that you take a look at your own transportation needs and wants and make a choice. If you have a car that you're not ready to give up, or you're not ready to give up car ownership, and you can afford a new electric vehicle or a used one, I would recommend you get one as soon as possible. And there's a lot of sustainability folks, I'll say even Presidians that I talk to regularly, and some of them espouse the view that they're going to drive their Prius into the ground. I think that's a very common sentiment, and one that's I can relate to. I still have a Prius, but you can improve the energy efficiency, overall efficiency of the US fleet, like by getting into an electric vehicle or a plug-in hybrid now and selling your Prius is going to go affordably to somebody else who may not be in a hybrid, and improve their efficiency and allow them to save more money while they're driving too. You're going to drive down your fuel cost by over $1,000 a year. Even if you're not driving a ton, you're going to drive down your maintenance cost by another $300 to $500 a year, because there's less moving parts in an electric vehicle than a gas car. And you're going to drive down the overall efficiency of the fleet. So highly recommend, if you can afford it and you're ready to do it, you should get into an EV as soon as possible. If you can give up your car, or if you can live with one car, I have a spouse and a daughter who's 4, and we live with one car right now. COVID has made it easier to kind of do a lot of that, and I work almost 100% from home. But if you can afford to do that, that's another option. Or if you believe it, mass transportation works for you. Light rail is already electric. Buses can be electrified. Like, advocate for those things that you care about most. So I would advocate for an omni-channel approach to electrification and do what matters to you, because we need people who are passionate about the whole thing. And electrification is one of the best drivers of decarbonization and cost savings for you as a transportation user.
But I'll just throw in the obvious here: vote for policymakers that are EV friendly. So Peter covered everything else. Good job.
Okay, all right. So you both have worked internationally throughout your life, your career. Peter, you were in Africa doing some work. How does America's EV infrastructure compare to other countries, both developed and developing nations?
Scott, you want to take that one?
Peter, you go ahead. I don't really have the pulse on the on electrification of transportation infrastructure in developing developed areas. My work when I lived abroad was not in EV charging, and it was not in energy. So all of my knowledge is just basically from what I've read. I think Peter maybe has a little bit more of a pulse.
Yeah, a little bit more. I mean, Norway is obviously a shining example of light duty electric vehicle penetration, as made famous by Will Ferrell's Super Bowl ad from a couple of years ago, where he goes to Norway to see what's happening and why EVs are so popular there. They're now at over 75% of new cars sold in Norway today have an electric plug. So it's either hybrid electric or all electric, 100% battery electric. And a lot of what drove that, if you look, now they're kind of on an S curve in terms of the adoption. But if you look at the early days, one of the biggest drivers, from what I've heard from Norwegian policymakers, is, first of all, the infrastructure was invested in, similar to the way California and New York and other states made those investments. But they also waived a 20%, 25% VAT tax on new vehicles for electric. So effectively, it was like the effectiveness of a point of sale savings for customers. So they could literally take $10,000 to even $20,000 off the cost, because they're not paying any tax on a, say, $40,000, $50,000 vehicle. So that was the game changer, as I understand it, one of the biggest drivers there. So that was a huge driver. Europe, I think, is probably on par or exceeding, in certain countries, exceeding where the charging infrastructure is in the United States. But like the United States, there's more countries that have invested, like states like California and New York, there's other states that are still catching, or countries that are still catching up. Electrification in emerging markets, I think, is where a lot of interesting creativity is happening. If you are an entrepreneur that has international experience, it's a really exciting time to be working on electrification of transportation. Two friends of mine from Phoenix International are co-founders of a new electrification startup for financing electric buses based in Nairobi, Kenya, called Bossy Go. And they are basically like making the financing of they have a special financing mechanism, I believe, on the battery of the bus that allows a bus operator purchase a bus for the same effective rate as monthly payments as like a diesel bus, except their fuel costs get offset over time, and they kind of make monthly or daily, weekly payments on the battery of the bus. They kind of all even out and make the price again of like adopting and operating electric bus cheaper than a diesel one. So really exciting. There's other startups like for electrifying motorcycles, especially for delivery and transportation. Motorcycles are much more common in, say, East Africa, where I've spent most of my time abroad. There's a company called Ampersand out of Rwanda, and they're interestingly doing swappable electric batteries for motorbikes, and they've kind of built their own custom motorbike they lease to drivers. And because because Kigali in Rwanda is a very like dense urban area, they can kind of maintain this like closed loop and run a battery exchange pretty efficiently and keep a bunch of charged batteries ready to go. So when a driver pops in, they just swap the batteries and they're on to the next thing. So there's a lot of just creative electrification strategies that are happening around the world, and I think we're going to see more of these things deployed in the future.
Cool. Awesome. So with that, I'd like to just take some questions from the audience. So the first one is, what solutions are you seeing that makes EV charging accessible to people who live in multifamily housing or don't have access to a charging station?
Yeah, that's a great
The
question.
urban suburban thing, also.
Yeah, so there's a few different things. One is the team that I'm working on in Rivian. A big focus of ours is around providing access to folks that don't typically have access, because that's one of the key reasons why folks aren't buying electric vehicles, is because they don't have access to charging. So we're looking at a lot of places in partnerships with municipalities and other local agencies to build out charging infrastructure in areas where there's higher concentrations of apartment complexes or MUDs, with the hope that seeing the infrastructure that's more accessible will help drive those decisions. I think more directly what's happening is you have, and I'll speak for California, you have state level building codes that are being passed that are requiring certain levels of EV charging make ready, meaning like the power and the conduit and the stub outs require for any new buildings that are built in California. A lot of cities are going in excess of that. So they're requiring, like in the city of San Francisco, a couple of years ago, they required that any public parking garage, regardless if it's a new development or not, has to install a certain percentage of level 2 and/or diesel fast chargers. That doesn't directly apply to MUDs or apartment complexes, but then you have cities of like Los Angeles that they're going to be passing a code or a new law that will require any new MUD to provide not just the make ready, but also make it charge ready. And just a quick difference is make ready is you're providing the power and the infrastructure without the charger, and then charge ready is where it requires the actual charger to be there in place. So there are things that are happening that directly work to solve that issue.
Peter, anything to add to that, or?
I think Scott covered that one pretty comprehensively. Okay.
All right. So, as we all know, during COVID, we didn't go to work. We work from home quite a bit. The next question is how has public charging behavior been affected by COVID or commute patterns? Seems like workplace charging has trimmed quite a bit. What are you seeing out there in terms of?
Yeah, I see Peter went on mute, so I'll answer that. Yeah, certainly. I think it's fairly clear to folks that when you have most people working from home, that the need for charging at workplaces becomes less. There is somewhat of a transition of folks going back to work. I think employers, maybe not as much now, but as before, are looking at charging infrastructure in their buildings as an amenity and incentive to attract candidates to work at their company, even if they are only coming in a couple days a week. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely made an impact. When I was at Volta Charging, that was right through the height of the pandemic. Almost 100% of the partnerships I was developing with apartment complexes, not apartment complexes, with workplace, put those projects on pause. Do I think that was the right decision? No, but it definitely had an impact.
Yeah. Well, we're all hopefully going back to work, and I mean, I think whether it's a 3 days a week or 5 days a week, infrastructure has to be there to support the electrification of people's behavior.
Yeah, and what I'd say is, like, not just with workplace, but also back to like the apartment complexes, they're incentivized to provide EV charging, even if they're not required to by code, because it's a way to attract, at least right now, a certain demographic of folks to rent from their building. So I think developers and apartment complex owners are looking at charging, like a lot of other folks, as an amenity to increase traffic to a location or incentivize people to rent from their building.
Peter?
I think I'm excited about workplace charging coming back because, again, to the demand response need in states like California, where there's a lot of sunshine and solar energy coming on the grid during the day, charging at your workplace is actually one of the best times to charge and kind of soak up all that excess clean energy that's on the grid. So you don't have to charge as much, during peak hours like 4 to 8 or 4 to 9. When we have to turn on peakers every once in a while, especially during summer months, during heat waves. So huge opportunity there if we can get more workplace charging to grow.
Yeah. Okay. So our next question is, in what ways are the environmental and social impacts of lithium extraction being considered in the calculation of what we're discussing this evening? I think that's a big one.
I'll take this one. It's a popular, common question. And I would highly recommend a Motor Trend article that was recently published that I believe the title is something to the effect of "You're Being Lied to About Electric Cars." And the kind of different trade-offs that the fossil fuel industry is likely seeding into the debate to make it look like these are a battle of equals when it comes to like gas vehicles and gasoline in the petroleum industry and electric cars. So strongly recommend reading that article. But in terms of lithium extraction, it's my understanding that we're just at the beginning stages of understanding how we can efficiently and environmentally responsibly extract lithium. So one company that I recently came across at a mobility conference and met the founder of is a company called Energy X. And they're developing lithium extraction technology that improves the efficiency of lithium extraction using a few novel methods by more than 3x. So this is just more efficiently extracting it automatically is going to also result in better environmental outcomes there. And also the Southwest United States, particularly the Salton Sea in California, there's a wealth of lithium here in the United States that can be mined. And so in states, again, like the United States, where regulation is more above board and more strict, these are also places where environmental protections can be better enforced. So I think it's important to be mindful of these extractions and to enforce good mining policy across the board and also be more efficient. I think the main point I'll leave you with is that electric vehicles and the batteries specifically are an opportunity to create a closed loop system. An electric vehicle battery can live out a very nice life, 5 to 10 years. Yes, over time, like your cell phone, it is going to reduce its effectiveness and lower the range of the vehicle, which may be less attractive. Nissan Leafs sold 10 years ago, 97% of those batteries are still in cars. they have less range. They have maybe 60 to 70% of the range, but they're still drivable. Once the battery is rendered basically unattractive from a range perspective, they go to a nice battery farm where they're connected to other batteries out on the prairie and can serve again as battery storage for demand response. So when the grid needs more energy, companies running these giant batteries that are pulling these batteries together can sell that energy from the batteries back to the grid for a profit. Now, once that battery doesn't have a useful life in one of these demand response battery farms, it can then be recycled. And so you may be familiar with a company called Redwood Materials. It was founded by the CTO of Tesla, who left to found this company. They have third-party research that verifies they can recycle over 95% of batteries, not just EV batteries, but the same batteries that are in the laptops we're using right now, our cell phones. 95% of materials in batteries, and the science shows that when those materials are recycled, they retain 100% of their operational capacity. There's no loss. And so Redwood Materials just signed their first commercial partnership with Panasonic, major manufacturer of EV batteries across the board for Tesla and other automakers. That's going to launch in a couple of years. So we're going to be able to buy, again, electric vehicles that are new, that have recycled materials. And quite frankly, we can create a closed loop system here. We should be more mindful of better practices when it comes to mining, but you can't recycle gasoline. That's just a fact. And so this is a real opportunity. It is going to require some mining. It is going to require some environmental degradation. We can hope to minimize those impacts, but we are creating a closed loop system here, and that's what's truly exciting about this.
Cool. Scott, anything to add?
I mean, that was probably the most comprehensive answer that I've heard so far on that. I mean, just to put it in perspectives of math, I think if you could, and this is, I believe from the article, if you could just magically switch everything to electric, you're going to reduce the amount of energy usage by about 30%. And if you do that run off of via like natural gas, you would reduce that by about 48 or 50%. So the math is there for it, and I think that you have some really innovative companies that Peter has mentioned that are working on some of those more downstream challenges.
Are you seeing any alternative to battery technology that might be worthy of mention?
Peter, I'll let you.
Not any that I would call out by name, but I think some of the interesting things that are emerging are, ways to get different, like cadmium, for example. Tesla's developed a battery technology that removes cadmium, which is a rare earth metal, from their battery production. That was a big win. I think there'll be more of those. I think a lot of technologies will also focus on speed to charge. I've seen some studies from the lab that, again, maybe 5-10 years out in terms of commercialization, but the opportunity to charge your, fully power up your electric vehicle instead of waiting 30 to 50 minutes, that could happen in 5 to 10 minutes, maybe 2 minutes. Maybe it's like a gas station visit. There's certainly a lot of really smart folks doing a lot of deep science on this right now. Could take a while to get out there, but I think that's part of the battery technology optimization as well.
Cool. Awesome. So Scott, what is your take on charging connector standard, with Tesla making the connector as an open standard now called NACS, North American Charging Standard, for accelerating the transition to electric transportation? What do you think will be the impact, and whether NACS will agree to an open public charging standard as currently there are 3 types right now? I just received my Fisker charging something in the mail today, so I'm quite excited to hear the answer to this question.
Okay, so I caught most of that question, and I'm seeing it in the chat now. So if you give me a second, let me reread that. Yeah, I mean, I think anytime you have a network, especially one as large as Tesla's, moving to making it open to non-Tesla vehicles, that's a huge impact. I mean, they build a pretty robust network. I think that the thing that we have to keep in mind is that the the technology with the Tesla port, the proprietary technology is in the port. And so I think if you're not a Tesla driver, you would have to buy a Tesla adapter in order to use those charging stations. I don't know what those price points are going to be, but overall, yes, moving to open network for a network like Tesla is definitely a step in the right direction.
Cool, awesome. All right, for Peter, we're going to do our last question. Will we see solar cells in the roofs of EVs? Is capturing a couple of miles of power, or is it worth the cost? I mean, I've always wondered that myself, because often you see these hot roofs, and we have in California is always sunny. Can you give us some information on that?
Yeah, I think under current technology conditions, I'd say not yet. There is a one company, an electric vehicle company, looking to achieve precisely what you're describing, like a solar powered car. I think it would be much more effective just to charge off clean power on the grid, or charge off solar panels in your home or your workplace. But who knows, like what in terms of technology breakthroughs might be coming. It could become effective one day, but not today.
Okay, cool. Okay, I think Maggie this was our last question. And I think Maggie's going to close us out. Is Maggie, do you want to turn on your camera? Or maybe Rachel? You're still muted. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Just wanted to thank you all for joining us this evening. I learned so much from all of your questions. We'll be sending a follow-up email with the recording. A huge thank you to Vic for moderating, and to obviously Peter and Scott for joining us. And we are planning another Presidio Presents event in the spring that will center around women in sustainability. So stay tuned for that, and hope everybody has a wonderful winter break.
Okay, awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody.